John. In some ways, I'm going to have some continuity between this morning and this afternoon, because I think that part of our present predicament is not so much that suddenly a crisis of trustworthiness has arisen, and so we have sought to a crisis of trust reflecting a crisis of trustworthiness has arisen, but it's rather that we've been trying to improve trustworthiness for a very long time, and I suppose we've hoped that might improve trust, but that doesn't seem to have happened. And I think that's a very new predicament and bears a lot of reflection. It's what I called in the Wreath Lectures the Cassandra problem. You remember Cassandra, the prophetess of Troy, prophesied the truth, but she was not believed. What happens in a world where people, even if they are trustworthy, are not trusted? Now, we know that if they're untrustworthy, it's just right and proper that they're not trusted. But what if they aren't trusted anyhow? And so I want to, that's the sort of continuity between this morning and this afternoon. But this morning I'm going to talk about a particular traditional way in which we seek to achieve trustworthiness and thereby, hopefully, but not always, trust. And that is to rely upon promises, agreement, or, as the modern idiom will tend to have it, informed consent. Of course, informed consent is just a pleonasm. There isn't another form of consent called uninformed consent, because if you're uninformed, it ain't consent. But if you'll forgive me the standard pleonasm, I shall use it. And my, as it were, object of study will be some of the things that have gone on specifically in medical ethics, not on the whole in bioethics more generally. Now, there is, as usual in all human affairs, a triumphalist, providentialist story of progress that we can all tell one another. And it runs roughly like this. Medical ethics has been transformed during the last 30 years. We have far more emphasis on informed consent, and we take this now to be essential for ethically acceptable medical practice. The literature on informed consent is ginormous and repetitive as can be. But I think it has very significant limitations, that a few of the difficulties are extremely well known, much discussed, and quite recalcitrant, although actually this surprisingly seldom dents the enthusiasm of people who are keen on informed consent. But in this paper, I'm also going to talk about some of the less commonly mentioned difficulties. They're not so often discussed, but I think they are philosophically deeper, and that they limit the use to which informed consent procedures can be put in the area of health provision, particularly public health provision. Now, some of the most frequent disagreements are, of course, about reasons for thinking that consent is ethically important. Is it important because that's the way we respect persons, or we respect the autonomy of persons? If that's what's important, which conception of autonomy do people have in mind? And if some people are less autonomous than others, would it follow that informed consent procedures would be less important for the less autonomous? Or would they, on the contrary, be more important for the less autonomous? Or, alternatively, are they required because they provide a degree, just a degree of assurance that patients are not deceived or coerced in the course of clinical practice? What is the justification? Now, as is very well known, informed consent became prominent in medical ethics as a requirement not so much on medical practice, but on research on human subjects. And it forms part of the Nuremberg Code formulated at the time of the doctors' trials in 1947. In the code, there's zero mention of autonomy. It goes, the voluntary consent of the human subject is absolutely essential. That's the research subject, not the patient. And this is glossed as follows. This means that the person involved should have the legal capacity to give consent, should be so situated as to be able to exercise free power of choice without the intervention of any element of force, fraud, deceit, or duress, should have sufficient knowledge, comprehension of the elements of the subject matter, That requires that before the acceptance of a decision by the subject, there should be made known to him the nature, duration, and purpose of the experiment, the method and means by which it's conducted, all the inconveniences and hazards reasonably to be expected, the effects upon his health and person, etc. Now, this gloss on why informed consent is important sits far closer to its traditional accounts of the importance of consent in political philosophy. Underlying idea here is the old principle, volenti non fit injuria, to him who is willing, no injury is done. Action is acceptable when the subject consents. Of course, that code isn't an argued, or even the gloss on the code isn't an argued explicit justification. But I think one can see in it the thought that actions rendered acceptable by informed consent, because that indicates there wasn't force, fraud, duress, or deception, FFDD. Now, a far more elaborate spelling out of informed consent requirements for research can be found in the latest version of the Declaration of Helsinki, 2002, on all websites that deal with this. And there it says, the subjects must be volunteers and informed participants in the research project. That's pretty close to Nuremberg. Then it says, the right of research subjects to safeguard their integrity must be respected. Every precaution should be taken to respect the privacy of the subject, the confidentiality of the patients. He or she has become a patient, not a research subject. Information, to minimize the impact of the study on the subject's physical and mental integrity. He or she has gone back to being a research subject. And on the personality of the subject. Then also, in any research on human beings, each potential subject must be adequately informed of, listen to this, the aims, methods and sources of funding and any possible conflicts of interest, the institutional affiliations of the researcher, the anticipated benefits and potential risks of the study and the discomfort it may entail. The subject should be informed of the right to abstain from participation in the study, to withdraw consent to participate at any time without reprisal, and after ensuring that the subject has understood the information, the physician, who's a physician, not a researcher suddenly, should then obtain the subject's freely given informed consent, preferably in writing. And if it cannot be obtained in writing, the non-written consent must be formally documented and witnessed. Fascinating document, that. It's interesting, of course, to note that the Helsinki Declaration says nothing about autonomy. It assumes that consent's needed, and it indicates some very elaborate procedures for requesting and recording that consent. It has a lot to say about the process of conducting ethically acceptable research, but little about the reasons for thinking informed consent essential to that research. Now, there seem to me to be quite a lot of difficulties lurking in what I just caricatured as the transition from Nuremberg to Helsinki. Let me go back to a second and much more familiar range of problems before I return to the Nuremberg-Helsinki transition. The familiar range of problems constantly discussed is that patients often can't grasp information essential to giving informed consent. They can't understand the proposition to which their consent is sought. If they can't give or refuse consent. And the hard cases are very numerous and very intractable and certainly constitute the vast majority of cases in the treatment of patients. That's because the incidence of medical treatment is much larger among the population of people whose capacities to consent are impaired because they're too young, too ill, too demented, than it is among the population at large. So people can't consent to intervention or treatment because they're too young, too ill, too disabled, too demented to understand the information, and they could hardly be denied medical treatment because of these problems. So it has to be given without their consent. Should it then be given on the basis of somebody else's consent, parents, guardians, relatives? Or does the idea of proxy consent make a mockery of the fundamental concerns that are taken to justify informed consent, indeed show disrespect for people and their autonomy? Should proxy consent be put aside as mere pretense, replaced with greater reliance on professional judgment of best interests, or does that represent a reversion to paternalism in medical practice? Answers to these questions often suggest we should revise or refine procedures for requesting and recording information to make consenting easier for the less competent. But even the most energetic, time-consuming procedures are not going to be available in all cases. You can be as user-friendly as you like, and there will be many, many patients for whom informed consent remains impossible, unless, of course, you fudge what constitutes being informed and thereby what constitutes consent and what's the worth of that. Now, these are, in my view, not the deepest difficulties. Informed consent procedures are problematic, not merely because their philosophical rationale is disputed, not merely because some people lack competence to consent, or sometimes lack it. The most basic philosophical difficulty with informed consent arises because consenting is what philosophers rather rebarbatively call a propositional attitude. Consenting, like other cognitive states such as knowing, believing, understanding, hoping, wondering, thinking, desiring, fearing, takes a proposition as its object. Consent is never directed at the medical intervention or research procedure as such, but rather at some proposition that describes an intended intervention or treatment. However, any intervention, as we know, can be described in many ways. Even in the easy cases where competent patients consent to a procedure or treatment described in this way, they may not be aware of, may not consent to, other true descriptions of the same intervention or its more obvious effects. This can be the case even when the second description is entailed by the first, or when it refers to an obvious consequence of the first. So propositional attitudes are what we call opaque. A person may know or understand or hope that X, but not know or understand or hope that Y, even when X entails Y. A patient may consent to the intervention, and this intervention, as described, may entail or bring about certain conditions, but the patient may not consent to those entailments or those results because they don't grasp the entailment relation or they don't grasp the causal connection. A parent may consent to the removal of tissues from their dead child for research, and undifferentiated reference to tissues will cover many body parts, any in a way. The parent may not know that this is so and be upset to discover that entire organs were removed on the basis of a more general consent to removal of tissues. Now, since propositional attitudes are always opaque, the basic difficulty can't be eliminated simply by making more information available or consent procedures more user-friendly. For unless the information is actually understood by those whose consent is requested, genuine consent won't stretch to the relevant proposition. This difficulty, in my view, is ubiquitous within the central debates of medical ethics in the last 25 years and little discussed. But the difficulties have been heightened, and I think not resolved, by recent attempts to improve consent procedures. Two supposed improvements are advocated, and both of them raise difficulties. On the one hand, it's said what we need is explicit rather than implied consent. And on the other hand, it is said that what we need is specific rather than generic consent. Let me deal with both of these thoughts. The distinction between explicit and implied consent, which of course goes back to 17th century political philosophy, contrasts two ways of consenting. It isn't about the content of consent, it's the ways of consenting. Explicit consent, as we all know, typically relies on documents, signatures, formal statements, may need witnesses who confirm that proper procedures for consenting have been followed. And the reason I read you that passage from the 2002 version of Helsinki was to show how far that has penetrated. The formal procedures are designed, of course, to create enduring records and to reduce later uncertainty about the consent given and perhaps to forestall dissatisfaction, complaints and litigation. Patients who consent explicitly to proposed interventions accept that they cannot later claim that they were injured or wronged by those interventions, and they'll not have grounds for complaint or litigation. By contrast, implied consent is inferred from patients, more generally from a person's action. For example, agreement to blood being taken or to having an injection is standardly signified within the context of the medical consultation by sticking one's arm out. You know, you do that. And there's no documentation of that consent. It would be possible, though extremely laborious, to replace implied consent for taking blood with explicit procedures and so for all other really routine elements of medical treatment and intervention. But however far you go in making things explicit and consent forms for interventions more numerous, and however hard you push on eliminating implied consent, explicit consent always relies on background understandings that remain implicit. Trust, of course. The longest and most complex consent form won't include a complete description of everything that will be done. Complete descriptions are mythical. Much is always taken as understood. Now, the distinction between specific and generic consent isn't about the process of consenting. It applies to the propositions to which consent is given. For example, consent could be given to the removal of tissues, or to the removal of a specific sort of tissue, or removal of tissue for a specific use, such as diagnosis, or such as part of a cancer treatment, or such as post-mortem to determine cause of death. The descriptions to which consent is given are once again necessarily always incomplete. You could always add more detail, true detail. So those who believe that informed consent should be highly specific ought to explain how specific it has to be in order to constitute ethically adequate informed consent. And answering that question, in my view, is no easier than answering the pseudo-question, how long is a piece of string? And these two problems aren't merely theoretical. They surface and they create practical problems in all cases where treatment is undertaken, where tissues or information are or could be used for purposes that have not been specified at the time the information was obtained or the tissues removed. There are countless such cases. Epidemiology, review of cases to examine the results of treatment, use of tissues or information for secondary data analysis. In all these cases, if personal information is processed, obtained, recorded, sorted, used, only in accordance with the consent of those to whom the information pertains, the so-called data subjects of modern data protection legislation, it will constantly turn out that if the consent obtained was sufficiently specific to permit a certain use, it will be sufficiently specific to preclude other uses. Now, if tissues and information from past patients can't be used for purposes that were not anticipated, that's a problem. Nothing can be studied without specific consent. Such consent often could not, in principle, have been obtained at the time, and so the relevant consents won't be there. For example, nobody could tell that when the first patients with new variant CJD died, this was a new illness. They didn't know whether it was old variant genetic or sporadic CJD. How did they find out? By comparing brain tissue samples with samples taken from those who had died across many countries, across many decades, from the very rare condition of CJD. It's difficult to see how secondary data analysis of that sort could ever permissibly be done if access to tissue samples and data pertaining to past patients, their treatment and their clinical outcomes can't be consulted without specific prior consent to those studies. Can you imagine saying to somebody who is dying and nearly demented with CJD of the ordinary sort, if in the future there might be some disease that a bit resembles your disease but may or may not be the same disease, may we study your brain tissue? It's ridiculous. Now, my final grounds for thinking that we're on the wrong track in thinking about informed consent has to do with public health. Here I think we find more general reasons for seeing that informed consent is a fairly limited and precise tool. One of the informed consent procedures simply don't work where goods or benefits provided are public goods. Certain types of goods, consumer goods, clinical care among them, can be given to individuals, and then you can make action contingent on informed consent. But informed consent for public goods is, I think, impossible. Public goods must be provided or not provided for whole groups, sometimes populations, sometimes limited groups. And for present purposes, I leave that difference aside. But if you think about it, fundamental public health provisions that support road safety, food safety, water safety, the safety of medicines, and measures that protect against infection cannot be tailored to individual choice. If there aren't obligations to do the impossible, informed consent cannot be ethically required in providing public goods. Now, the implications of these thoughts are, I think, very much wider than one might initially imagine. For the clinical care itself has to be provided, at least within a given country, to standards and formats that cannot be adjusted to individual informed consent. The scaffolding of professional training, institutional structures, public funding, physical facilities are all public goods. The public provision of health care and can reflect democratic process and thereby certain elements of collective choice, but its basic structures cannot be geared to individual choice, nor therefore to informed consent. So unavoidably, there are very large areas of medical practice and medical ethics in which informed consent can play only a minor part. Yes, I remember I set my watch 4 minutes ahead, so I'll keep within that. This, I think, raises some considerable issues of justice. Medical ethics of the last 30 years has focused, in my view, excessively on transactions between individual practitioners, professionals, and individual patients or research subjects. These individualistic approaches are useful for analysing some sorts of issues, but not for analysing ethical questions about the provision of public goods, including public health provision and the background structures of clinical care. Now, it might seem that theories of justice would do better here, but so far, many of the ways in which theories of justice have been used to look at health issues have been to look at issues about the distribution of treatment to individuals, that is rationing, I think it's called rationing, rather than at the ethics of public health provision. Now, I think the use of theories of justice to answer distributive questions is no doubt an important set of issues, but it isn't the same as the question of the justice of fundamental health provisions which are not tailorable to individuals. There's more to justice, in short, than distributive justice. All theories of justice address the justification of compulsion, in particular, of course, the compulsion on which any legal order depends. There are many different theories of justice, and just by way of illustration, I'm going to choose one because it assigns a very large part, supposedly a maximal role, to individual liberty and thereby to informed consent procedures. So think of John Stuart Mill's form of liberalism, especially as developed in On Liberty, and I choose it not because it's necessarily more plausible than alternatives, but because he very explicitly opposes compulsion except in very limited circumstances. I'm sure you'll remember his famous claim, the sole end for which mankind are warranted, individually or collectively, in interfering with the liberty of any of their number is self-protection. Compulsion is permitted only when needed to protect others, to prevent harm to others, and public health provision is an obvious area where Mill's arguments are relevant, since compulsion may be needed to prevent individual action that might harm others' health. Let me give you a recent example, SARS, or another emerging new infectious disease that causes a reasonable number of deaths. In SARS, about 8 to 10%. Mill would view it as legitimate to make certain forms of action or treatment compulsory in response to emerging diseases if the risk of transmission is moderately high and of death for those who succumb or grave illness quite high for some. Depending on the gravity of the risk, he might think it permissible to institute mandatory monitoring of those who may have been exposed, mandatory vaccination if a vaccine is developed, restrictions on free movement, ultimately quarantine. And equally, where vaccination is safe and effective, he would suggest that it may be legitimately compulsory in order to provide herd immunity. We cannot all be free riders on others' vaccinations. Making health measures such as these compulsory would hardly have seemed controversial a century ago. It has, I think, come to seem controversial on the basis of a quite illusory assumption that all medical provision, including public health provision, can be organised on the basis of the informed consent of each affected individual. It cannot. There are, of course, difficulties of judging it, but in the end, even on a very strong liberal account of justice, no good ethical arguments forbid all compulsion. To the contrary, appeals to individual consent can't offer us a coherent, let alone acceptable way of approaching public health issues. Salus populi suprema lex, as Cicero said, is still a relevant thought. Thank you. Your thoughts? Can you hear at the back? Yes, they can. It's good acoustics.
You said that the approach that we've been taking is the wrong approach. I'm not clear what you feel is the right approach, or what you're suggesting.
What I've suggested is, I suppose, two things. That we cannot generalize what you would call the new medical ethics that began in the 1970s with its very strong emphasis on informed consent across the whole field of health provision. It will only work in relatively narrow and focused areas. And you might say that this is the preoccupation of rich societies with high-tech medicine to think that's what it's all about. Actually, in rich societies, we depend, as in poor societies, even more on our public health provision, on the quality of the water supply, the sanitation, the refuse collection, the standards to which doctors are trained, and so on and so on. So I'm arguing that we have had a sort of double move. Originally, the Helsinki emphasis on informed consent was for research subjects, and it was against fraud, force, duress, and deception. Prevent those. Very limited focus. Suddenly we've seen the Helsinki requirements inflated by the emphasis on specific express consent, and then what was intended for research ethics of a certain type generalized across the waterfront to all medical ethics. It's been a very powerful movement, both in the United States, where I think in some ways it began, but globally. And I think we need to think about this movement at this stage, not to say that clinical treatment should be compulsory, but to think about the limits of informed consent. At the back.
That is my question. What constraints do you feel need to be put on informed consent in order to make this project?
Well, on this occasion, I've argued for, I suppose, 3 or 4. First of all, don't fantasize that you can use informed consent for things that are not effectively in private goods, like consumer goods or clinical care. Secondly, don't imagine that informed consent can always be wholly specific, because the very nature of describing what's being done cannot be made wholly specific. Thirdly, don't imagine that informed consent can be wholly explicit, because you will get into the question of how explicit to make the procedure. Jürgen Moltmann's examples of the layered systems by which the passport was verified are a wonderful example of a process that is supposed to be complete, but this process of making explicit cannot be made fully complete. You just get an infinite regress down that road. And I suppose finally, the much discussed problem of cognitive impairment of some patients or some research projects is, I think, a much bigger problem than people who nibble at bits of it suggest, in that once you take in this question about the opacity of consenting, you realize we're all, to a degree, cognitively impaired, and the problems John referred to of how far do you disclose the risks is not, as it were, the medical establishment being coy. It is that you cannot have total disclosure of all risks. This seems to be lost on people who write declarations. Briefly, yes.
The opaqueness of propositional attitudes and the rest of the constraints that you just put on it, though, it seems like you could leave the concept vacuous at some point, because all those apply in some relationship that we're not specific or we're generic. There's things we don't understand. Who makes those decisions and how?
Any decisions that are made within a society, within an institution, by an individual, have in the first sort of mild reality constraint that they have to face. And I think we would be more honest with ourselves and one another if we said in the end, in the nature of the case of what it is to consent, consent has to be generic. You cannot build everything in. And then you said, in the nature of the case, there's a limit to how explicit you can make the process of consenting. There has to be a limit. So I'd go for realism at that point, and in the nature of the case, you can't have individual consent for the provision of public goods in the economist sense of the term. Yes.
I think most of us who've had surgery or have been asked to do an implied consent and sign a document. I think most of those documents are quite daunting to read.
It's like taking out a mortgage, isn't it?
I think one of the things you say, more information or more transparency doesn't necessarily help. Is I think you also recognize communication as a receiving process, not a sending process. And one of the things I didn't hear you talk about is who seeks this consent. It could be a physician who knows quite a lot about what is going to be done and the patient. It could be a nurse or a medical technician. It's often an administrative person. The administrative person is basically trying to get the informed consent signed. They don't know very much about what's going to happen. They're not able to answer many questions. And I think another important aspect of this is who seeks this and how much the patient is enabled to ask questions to find out, to learn what kind of consent am I really giving here.
Yes, I think that's lovely. I believe in some American hospitals they've invented a verb transitive called consenting, as in, have you consented her yet? Which is extremely funny when you think what it's meant to be about. And so you have a sort of preliminary procedure called being consented. But to get back to more serious terrain, the question, where things are sufficiently important, and I think we recognize this, what we need, if we're to be able to trust the physician, is the opportunity for some conversation, some, I call it check and challenge. That's a slightly more aggressive term than is perhaps ideal, but it has to be two-way. I shall say something this afternoon about the way in which I believe we are increasingly substituting unidirectional conceptions of communication, actually not communication, for proper two-way relationships and communication. And finally, in the medical context, there are some conditions where it is possible to have a thorough discussion with the physician. There are many, many where it's not. Sometimes because of impaired capacities, sometimes because of technical complexities, sometimes because of the emergency nature of the treatment.
You began with a sort of descriptive question asking what sort of, in our current context, what happens when people are trustworthy but still not trusted. And then you talked about sort of how informed consent and sort of promise-keeping has been a sort of traditional way to think about engendering trust, and that there are difficulties with that. And so I'm curious what you think besides informed consent?
Well, of course, I really ended up saying that informed consent procedures have been developed in ways that are not trust-supporting because they have been excessively bureaucratized, routinized, and actually, in some ways, the patient feels written out of the informed consent process. They have been, if you like, bureaucratized because if you were to do a sort of hard-nosed analysis of why consenting has caught on so much, it has caught on because this is a way of transferring responsibility to the patient and avoiding complaint and litigation. That is why institutionally informed consent procedures are dominant. Now, so I think that informed consent, although if, as it were, done properly where it can be done, it may be a way of securing trustworthiness that also earns a measure of trust. When it is done where it can't be done, it does not secure a measure of trust. Everybody who has an operation in the United States has given their informed consent. Why don't they always trust what they've been through? I'm going to talk this afternoon about some other well-established modes of trying to secure a degree of trustworthiness and whether those other modes of securing trustworthiness also support the maintenance or the growth of trust. I think that some of them also have difficulty. But I wanted to look at this one first because it is in a way a most traditional thing. It is, after all, an ingredient in any market economy that we lay a lot of emphasis on informed consent. And I think you can see that I could have done many of these examples equally plausibly talking about business transactions where the consumer, as he or she gets unpleasantly reified, is quite good at deciding to buy these apples but not those apples, but may be much less competent when it comes to the purchase, let us say, of a financial product. So many of the problems about everybody's capacities being limited do return to us with a vengeance within market structures. But I was asked to talk about bioethics. Right at the back again.
I'm actually glad that you mentioned the conversational aspect of informed consent because having thought to some extent about this issue myself, I agree that we have gone down the wrong path insofar as what it is that informed consent is supposed to be about. But I think that part of the problem has to do with that people don't take the Nuremberg Code as seriously as perhaps they ought. And that there has been in some circles a wholesale retreat, not from the letter, but from the spirit of what Nuremberg is supposed to be about. And that fits into the concerns about consent just being something that one must get, as opposed to it simultaneously being a process by which one gets what would be counted for as a legitimate and authentic consent. There's this, it's almost as if people treat consent as an event instead of it's also being a process. And I guess the other thing I would say would be that, and perhaps this is in support of this line of argumentation, a number of years ago, Jay Katz, who teaches here at Yale, and Alice Capron actually took the time to explicate the process-oriented values that underlie informed consent, which have to do with respecting human integrity, avoiding deceit and coercion, educating people, this, that, and the other thing. That's what seems to have been lost from the conversation. And that it would seem to be that the time has come to use consent as a trust-building exercise and stop treating it in the ways we have, which is as a trust-eroding exercise.
Very good points. I agree with you very much that the values that underlay Nuremberg are extremely important. Avoiding force, fraud, deception, and duress. What could be more important? But what is very interesting, and the reason I read those fundamental documents is that Helsinki is looking at microprocess. Helsinki has paved the way to requiring specific and explicit consent. And once you write specific and explicit consent in, and it is, I believe, making the burden of process so great that it's not to be wondered at if down the road consent becomes a way by which people feel they were manipulated. Exactly the opposite of what Nuremberg was about.
Last year we had the SARS epidemic in Asia, and the countries that were most affected were China and Hong Kong and Singapore and Canada, Taiwan a bit too. The way that the countries responded in the matter of consent differed quite a bit.
Sure did.
And so there was a trade-off between the perception of the public good and the rights of the individual, which certainly came close to coercion in some places. What did you think about this, and what model did you feel, under the circumstances, was the best?
This paper was first worked on for a conference that the Royal Society organised in January called What Have We Learnt from SARS? And that's been published in the Transactions of the Royal Society Biological Proceedings. So my understanding of the epidemic was very much formed by that meeting, which involved a lot of scientists and clinicians and public health officials from all of those countries. One thing on which there was very general agreement was that on this occasion the World Health Organization had worked well, and that the international collaboration had worked well in the sense that people didn't worry about priority in investigating what the disease was. It was also made quite clear that it was only very specific factors that prevented a much larger and graver epidemic, of which the most crucial is that the stage at which people are most likely to transmit the disease is a number of days into it, perhaps about 8 days. By then they're usually in hospital. Another form of emerging infectious disease might not have that beneficent characteristic. Finally, I think one of the things that is probably has led people to think SARS was a minor episode, simply because it was successfully contained, but also because the deaths were predominantly concentrated among the elderly. If those had all been children, I think we'd have seen a different response. Children seem to be less affected than adults by SARS. But this is, one specific contagious, actually not infectious disease, and a success story. But there were lessons to be learned from it. Yes?
I'm coming at this from a literary background, and yet Yates does the gyre. And it seems to me that there are two fundamental push-pulls here. He talks of the emphasis on the individual and then emphasis on the group. And the issue with who makes the decision about saying, okay, we're going to do this for public health is in flux here. Plus, as the question from back here, there's another push-pull with not the individual and the group, but the efficacy. You start out with a situation and then you try to never have it happen again, and then it starts backfiring, and it's a result of nothing.
Well, look, I think that economics and political theory over the last 3 centuries have given us the apparatus for thinking, much as I'm a lover of Yeats, of thinking about this with a good deal more analytic precision. And the fundamental distinction in this area is that between a private and a public good. A private good is something you can distribute, like the cards in a deck of cards. A public good is something you can't distribute, like the air you breathe. And if you just follow through from that distinction, you get your first conclusion which is you can make the distribution of private goods contingent upon individual consent. Whether you should and how you structure it is a further question. But you actually cannot make the decisions about public goods on the basis of individual consent. You can't say, I want water safety at this level, while your neighbour says, but I want it at that level if there's a public water supply. Simple as that.
But it is an individual decision, or a small group of people deciding.
Now, you've got a further question for which political philosophy has got long traditions of quite precise discussion about how a decision that can't be an individual decision might be made in various ways. So if that's what you're interested in, you need to look at the arguments for democratic theory, at the arguments for how you connect expert decision-making with democratic process, and again they're intricate, but I can't set all those out in a lecture or the responses to questions at this level, but I can assure you that there are not just vague thoughts, but actually some quite precise, usable economic, political and philosophical theories down the route, which we can help ourselves with. Yes?
Right. You mentioned that there might be an irony developing whereby informed consent might be seen as manipulation. And I'm wondering if you could talk a bit about the issue of negligence.
Mm-hmm.
And informed consent. If following your argument that a part of informed consent is pushing responsibility towards patients, subjects who may not have access to information, what does that mean is then still the role of those who have more information and understanding, the researcher, the medical professional, even if there is informed consent, are they then relinquish from responsibility with their particular understandings? Is there issue of negligence that we consider?
I think you're quite right to focus on negligence and leave malfeasance aside, because that raises quite different issues, and I appreciate that. What I think we are doing to professionals is making probably unreasonable demands upon them that they get, after all, if we listen to Helsinki in its latest version, in research, and people often take this to be the requirement for clinical practice as well, that they obtain both specific and explicit consent. Now, in all honesty, can that be done? Well, I can pretend to do it. I can flood the patient with information, which is not communication. I can disseminate or disclose information. But if we hold the threat of litigation for negligence over people's heads, they will, of course, and understandably, take the pro forma moves to avoid complaint and litigation. So I think, if I have a policy thought in this, is we had better row back from Helsinki. Now, Helsinki is going to be extremely hard. It's very well entrenched. But Helsinki may be a possible model for very specific sorts of clinical research. For example, possibly drug trials. It isn't even a possible model for a great deal of epidemiological research, a great deal of clinical research, which looks retrospectively at the experience of, anonymized of course, of patients who had treatment of different sorts for different conditions. So if we want to support the quality of medicine, we have to accept that much research can't be subjected to these highly individualistic and voluntaristic ways of legitimating things. I'm reminded of a thought of the late Bernard Williams, where he said, we must not rest too much on the fragile structure of the voluntary. And when I'm feeling ill, I want even less rested on the fragile structure of the voluntary, which doesn't mean physician power, it means alternative structures.
Well, actually, I wanted you to expand a little, to go a little bit into the field of actual medical research. I have this impression from what you were saying, that it might not always be an individual decision of, when you talk about group consent into going into things, and maybe you could talk about group consent as going into medical research.
Group consent, I suspect, is a desperate remedy sought by people who realised that individual consent wasn't going to work for all sorts of purposes. Just conceivably, for example, in clinical genetics, where you're doing familial research, there may be a case for a group, in this case a family, to be the consenting body. Nobody has worked out a coherent way in which to implement that. But on the whole, it's not group consent. It is the nature of both justification and legitimation of public processes of decision-making, be they judicial, democratic, or other that we are talking about here. Because please don't get the impression that because I think there's a limited role that informed consent can play for us, that therefore anything goes where it can't play that role. On the contrary, I think at that point our thinking has to be a great deal more political, and I don't mean just, as it were, electoral politics in that. I mean the whole broad sweep of thinking about governance, thinking about democratic decision-making, thinking about judicial decision-making. So in the end, I'm saying once you start thinking about the ethics of public health, and do remember that public health interventions in rich societies as in poor contribute more to human health than any amount of clinical care. Once you take that into account, you have to take political philosophy, not just the ethics of individual transactions, as fundamental in thinking about the legitimacy of health interventions.
Maybe we could have just one more question.
This may be tangential, but there's an informed consent area that I've been interested in, and it's the worldwide AIDS epidemic. And in this country, the person who goes for testing and consultation, let's say at a local public health office, many of our towns have such offices where you can go for confidential testing and so on. But it's the right of the individual only to give consent that anybody that they've had sexual relations with, for example, be told. And I wonder if other countries deal with it that way. I mean, here's a person spreading a life-threatening disease and a huge public health question. And I've always been so surprised that all the financial institutions have been protected. For example, I had a retirement plan that had a insurance part of it. And every year the insurance would go up, and every year the company would come out and test me for AIDS. So they were protected. But if I had AIDS, nobody that I could have spread it to would have been protected. And it would just always seem to be a justice issue.
I think that we have now got a criminal offence of knowingly transmitting it. And it seems to me, yes, one more lethal weapon, knowingly to transmit. It can, of course, be very complicated when a person does not know that they have AIDS, and there's the question of whether they understand the realities of transmission. And clearly there is a lot of false belief and willful self-deception in that area. But if there is an offence by individuals who knowingly and with understanding transmit it, I take it, and of course if the partner has consented, also knowing and understanding is a different question, but knowingly transmitted it to someone without informing them, I would think that is a case for a criminal sanction, not just a civil remedy.
Thinking about your reading of the Helsinki Doctrine, and I know you touched on litigation, but it raises the question in my mind, and I know we're not at the law school,
I think so. I think we need, and it bears on your question too, I think we do need to rethink negligence, probably. I also think this is very programmatic, that we have probably gone down a cul-de-sac in many countries in our approach to data protection, in that if data were, so to speak, isolated facts, size of my bank balance today and tomorrow, that sort of fact, that would be perhaps something you could protect in this way. But at present, if you take seriously the inferential connections between different pieces of information, you end up protecting so much information that you actually, I think, do harm the public interest. And my oblique comments on epidemiological research were really about that. So I think there are some really serious legal rethinks lying down the road. I'm not a lawyer either, or perhaps you are a lawyer, but I do not know how to address it, but I'm certain that we've got it wrong on data protection in a fundamental and sort of philosophical way, and we may have also got it wrong on negligence. I noticed that in the England and Wales, which is one jurisdiction, the judges are holding down the lid on personal injury compensation awards. This is not a message that has yet reached the public, but I think it will.
I think we should stop now. Thank you very much.